20% of your efforts gives 80% of your results. Wow. Is that true? How does it work? And can you take advantage of it? Let's find out. G'day. Are you seeking to be a high-performance CEO or develop personal leadership and be a CEO of your own life? Then you've come to the right place, because we share real experiences from CEOs for you to learn from. And so you don't miss out, hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on all notifications. Let's get into it. Well, imagine if 20% of your time could give 80% of your results. Well, that's the Pareto Principle, also known as the 80-20 rule. It effectively says that 80% of your results come from 20% of your efforts. The Italian economist and polymath Vilfredo Pareto discovered this principle and published it in 1896. He noticed that 80% of the land ownership in Italy was owned by 20% of the population. And he also noticed this principle in other areas. His own pea garden generated 80% of its peas from only 20% of its plants. Now, the 80-20 rule is an empirical statement. It's a rule of thumb. For example, 80% of your customer revenue comes from 20% of your customers, or 80% of your job site accidents come from 20% of the hazards, or 80% of the problems customers have with your software comes from 20% of the bugs. And in the first order, this is a great principle to work with. However, people often make decisions based on their sentiment rather than their logical analysis, and to look retrospectively or a posteriori back to a theory and say that everything seemed logical. Now, the 80-20 rule has the possibility to be that kind of a theory. Now, some years ago, I was working at Nokia mobile phones. In fact, from the late 90s into the early 2000s, I saw Nokia both succeed and then, after I left, fail. One of the greatest zero to hero and hero to zero stories in modern entrepreneurial history. Now, Nokia had great success with using principles like the 80-20 rule. Now, for me, working in an operational level, we will be developing phones and software and other products that developed very quickly and had many, many bugs and issues with them. We were actually part of the advanced development group, which worked on the early platforms, which had lots of bugs in them. Now, the way that Nokia would handle those many, many bugs was to list them and then rank them in terms of their consequences and their likelihood of occurrence. And they would work on those with the highest consequence and the highest occurrence first. They would have hundreds of bugs on a newly developed platform, so they needed to rank the ones that were most important. Now, this is a Pareto principle. For example, some of the bugs were categorized as fatal and causing a user lockout, so that the user couldn't even get back in to use the phone. So it wasn't even just crashing the phone and causing a restart. They couldn't even boot it up again. So that would be a fatal and very serious high consequence bug. I don't know how often that would occur in that particular case, but I know that's like one of the rankings that was had. Let's take a step back and have a look at how Nokia grew, and grew well. They grew very, very well with what they knew. They were very well positioned to succeed in the GSM, or the cellular digital market, because they were early in. They were in the markets in Europe which were adopting this very quickly, and they doubled down on that. And the markets that they won at, they continued to win at, and they would develop more products and really push that. So really were succeeding, I think, with the 80-20 rule in terms of, going after the markets geographically and demographically that were successful. But how did they ultimately fail? Well, there's quite a few factors, but I think the 80-20 rule could also be applied here well. In fact, I think the over-application of the 80-20 rule may be the error that Nokia made. They continued to double down on the markets that were showing very, very high revenue. These were often the markets in Latin America, in India, in Russia, where phones were relatively inexpensive. And I remember looking at phones that were created for around about $10 US. So they had enormous customer base and then good revenues off the back of that. And that, by the 80-20 rule, would make sense. Continue to do what you do well and continue to go forward that way. However, this is where the 80-20 rule, I believe, failed Nokia. And that is that they missed major opportunity to go after the smartphone market. They were early adopters with the Symbian operating system, but that became quite difficult to use and was less popular than the iOS and the Android, which came through very, very quickly. And in fact, if you look at Apple and Samsung, they had very, very small number of offerings, and they were after this new market. Nokia unfortunately didn't see that, and the importance of that smartphone market and the ability to do things like iTunes and download songs and using your phone as a portal to so many other internet services that we take for granted today. I believe Nokia missed that because they were so focused on their high revenue historical customers rather than going forward and looking for these new opportunities. And of course, Nokia mobile phones is no more. Later in my career, I worked for another very successful technology company called Agyant Technologies, now called Avago Technologies. Now, at that time in the late 90s, early 2000s, Agyant was making the first optical mouse technology, the optical sensors, and they developed that through some clever engineering and listening to the customers. But what's important about this story and how it applies to the 80/20 is they had a great customer called Logitech. This customer was very, very successful in selling optical mouse products globally, and it was announced in 2008 that Avago, which was previously Agyant, had shipped over 600 million sensors to Logitech. Now, if you look at the other customers, Microsoft and HP and Dell and others, they all pale into significance compared to that one very dominant customer. Now, of course, they were a very, very important customer for Agyant, and they became the first and the priority for all development work within Agyant technology. And that was the reason they were so successful. So, great application for the 80/20 rule in terms of customers right there. Another great company that you may know very well is Quantis. I worked for Quantis Engineering developing an amazing refit to the 747 aircraft that they had. And part of the program was to do a detailed risk analysis. Now, risk analysis is not an 80/20 rule, but the 80/20 rule is like the first principle that you could use. A risk analysis is a much deeper, more thorough analysis of the situation. And in Quantis's case, there were hundreds, I think I remember 125 particular risks. Each one of those had to be identified, analysed, its consequences and its likelihood had to be ranked, and that was ranked as a risk. And the risk could be low, like negligible, like costing a few dollars, up to loss of an aircraft and millions of dollars worth of costs, and of course human lives, so extremely high consequences. So these consequences and likelihoods were ranked, and that ranking would then bubble up into the ones that were most important, and they would be worked on first. So in a similar way, it's a rule of thumb 80/20, working on those things that intuitively you can see are the most important. There is actually a risk analysis framework, which is an extension of the Pareto Principle that helps you analyze that even further. So again, the 80/20 rule is good to start with, perhaps when you don't have full information, but there are other tools out there like risk analysis, which can do much more and do a much better job of analyzing a risk situation, such as developing an aircraft or a reconfiguration to an aircraft, like in the case of Quantis. Now, in our own company, Skillion, we have been very successful with some customers. In fact, one of our customers we've had for 2.5 years has become our mainstay, and we get 80% of the revenues year on year from that one customer. Despite how difficult they are as a customer on many, many levels, I often remind myself that it's still 80% of the revenues that comes from the customer. Now, that's the 80/20 rule right there, but we've proven the 80/20 rule to be flawed, in the sense that just this year we picked up a new customer. Through our efforts in sales and marketing we've done over many, many years, we picked up a new customer, and this customer's revenues are looking to outgrow that of the other customer. So it's always important to maybe don't completely ignore that 20% of the other customers, because they may become your new future high growth and 80% of your revenue customers. Now, one great application of the 80/20 rule is in time management. As a CEO, they say you're often drowning in opportunities rather than starving of opportunities, and it's those opportunities which all take time, and your time is limited. So the 80/20 rule really helps to sort of give you a first order decision tool to use. One way I interpret the 80-20 rule is to think about how much I'm going to earn for my company for every hour I spend on a particular task or project. And one great way to think about that is to think of things that could be $10,000 tasks, and those that are $1,000 tasks, $100 tasks, $10 tasks, and $1 tasks. So when I say a task, let's put that an hour. So if I spend an hour on something, could I earn the company $10,000? Now I absolutely want to be doing that. When would that occur? Well, it's when I turn up to perhaps close a meeting with someone where I know there's a very good chance we're going to close a deal. That can be tens or $20,000 or $30,000. So turning up to those important sales calls where it's got a very good chance of closing a deal, that's got to be one of my $10,000 an hour tasks. Right down the other end might be the $1 tasks, such as scrolling through my emails and getting distracted by something that's not related to my work. There's a sports event or it's politics or something like that. Those things are very easily distracting me and not really helping me with my business. And then we can work in between from down to $1,000 tasks, which might be working specifically with one of my customers on a project with the CEOs and the executives. That would be $1,000 task. Maybe $100 task is my base rate for when I'm doing just general work with the customer. My $10 tasks might be sorting out my emails and answering emails and things like that. My $1 tasks, as I mentioned earlier. And I want to try and spend as much of my time up on those high value tasks. Now, what can I do with all those tasks that are of low hourly value? Well, I can ignore them, I can postpone them, but the better thing would be to delegate them to someone who has that hourly rate. So one of the things we do in my company is we offshore. We find people outside the company who can work on these projects and do these things at lower rates, maybe at $50 an hour or $20 an hour or even $10 or less than $10 an hour. So I can give those tasks to people where the rate matches the value, and that way I can still get the work done and still put my time into the high value tasks. So where might we want to show some restraint when it comes to the 80-20 rule? What areas in the CEO's life might that not be appropriate? One of them is in innovation development. It's never guaranteed that just doubling down on where current 80% of your innovation is coming from is going to be where the next big breakthrough comes. So ignoring that lower 20% might be quite dangerous for an innovative company. The second area might be in talent development. You can't put 80% of your efforts into just those top performing staff members. It takes time to develop skills and capabilities, and you're investing in time, and you have to invest in everyone's time. And then in culture, we can't also just push 80% of our rewards towards 20% of our staff. We need to again invest in the cultural fit and make sure things are done fairly within the organization. People respond very poorly to inequity in the workplace. So we need to always demonstrate equity and balance, and just rewarding those top performers would not be seen as fair. So the 80-20 rule of the Pareto Principle is a great tool for us to use, but not one to be overused. There are times when it's a great intuitive way to recognize and focus in on something which is already being successful, like your top customers. But also we have to be very cautious about over-applying it and missing out on other opportunities which are coming up for the medium to longer term. So I hope that helps, and thanks for watching.